Hey guys, so this is a topic I've shared my views on periodically throughout other videos, but I think it's one worth discussing in its own video. Not just in the sense of my own personal views, but the topic as a whole. It's a pretty common misconception that transmedicalism is inherently and definitionally anti-non-binary. While this isn't true in a definitional sense, nor do I think it's really true for the community as a whole, I do want to discuss the topic a bit deeper than just, hey, that's not what transmed really means, stop saying that, basically. So let's just get into the video. So I took a poll on this on the r/TrueScum subreddit and asked people to explain why they voted the way they did. This video will basically be going over a few things. Why do people believe transmedicalism is definitionally anti-NB? What do I think about it from the perspective of a transmed? And discussing the polls and responses from various opinions. I do want to make a few notes before we continue. I will be going over things from transmeds who do not support non-binary, and I am not doing so to say I agree with these positions. However, I want to look at them from as neutral a perspective as I possibly can, simply to hopefully show some of the understanding of why people feel this way. I will not be reading the comments verbatim from anyone, as I don't want to make it easy to find and harass people of any position. I also don't want this poll to be taken as a representation of the actual demographics of all transmeds. This very specific community I took the poll in may have different attitudes and be more common with some than others, and there are millions of transmeds, whereas this poll received 233 votes and 26 comments. While I absolutely do not agree with the anti-non-binary transmedicalist positions, I think that they're still very misunderstood and often boiled down into you hate non-binary people or you are a pick-me, and I think that that's a really unproductive way to have that conversation or try and change anyone's mind for that matter. Ultimately, to be able to discuss the topic with anyone, you need to have an accurate understanding of what their beliefs actually are, and I don't think that just assuming people are judgmental haters and tuning them out after that is a productive way to discuss the topic. So again, I want to make it very clear that while I will be explaining why people believe these things, I do not personally agree with them. I simply think understanding them makes it easier for us to discuss them, and I don't think that being vitriolic is productive on either side. So before jumping into the poll, why do people think transmedicalism is definitionally anti-non-binary? I think that there's two more simple answers to this. One, some transmeds actually are against non-binary, and two, it's easier to attack people who aren't actually transmed, but look a lot worse. Regarding the first one, I don't really think the average transmed who's against non-binary is as vitriolic or hateful as someone like Blair White, and many transmeds wouldn't consider her one based on her actual beliefs, or just don't like her. She has been very loud about claiming to represent us, along with others like Buck Angel or Calvin Gara. I won't really be discussing Calvin because frankly I have complex opinions on him, though I guess if y'all want a video on that, let me know. But regarding Blair and Buck and others like them, they are often aligned from the outside with transmedicalism. Well, frankly, I'm not sure if they've ever actually referred to themselves that way, and the only time I was able to find either of them using that word was a quote from Buck Angel saying, quote, "This person calling me a quote-unquote transmedicalist, as well as my great friend at Miss Blair White, shows the agenda and indoctrination that has been happening for years now in the transsexual space." They are widely referred to as transmed by others, even if they themselves, at least seemingly, don't actually identify with the term. Buck and Blair don't really hold transmed beliefs in a deeper sense. They don't believe transness to be, well, medical. They don't believe it to be real. Both of them use language to refer to themselves as their birth gender, with Buck Angel saying he's simply a woman who has a mental illness, dysphoria, and Blair sharing similar sentiments. Transmedicalism on a deeper level is pretty much the opposite of this. Dysphoria is the result of neurological differences. Our gender is quite literally what we believe it to be. The connection tends to come in with the focus on dysphoria, in my opinion. Whereas transmedicalism says dysphoria is an illness, one that's required for transness, you are the gender you transition into, because your brain is fundamentally different from that of your birth sex, which is what's causing the dysphoria. Whereas people like Buck Angel essentially say, yeah, I am a woman, but I have this mental illness and transition is the treatment for it. It's a much more turf position of, quote, you're still a woman/man actually, than it is a transmedicalist position of dysphoria is what makes you a different gender because it's fundamental. Essentially, these people are genuinely shitty, and a lot of transmeds are not fans of them and don't enjoy them just as much as the next person, and the few people I have seen that enjoy their content are usually still not in agreement with those beliefs specifically, but rather watch them in a way of they pick out the things they like and leave the rest of it type situation. So essentially, I think the reason for why people assume transmedicalism is definitionally anti-non-binary is less so because of the things actual anti-NB transmeds are saying, who are still a minority, and more so because of the public misunderstanding that Blair White not only is a transmedicalist, but just is transmedicalism. And her, along with Buck's ideology, is definitionally anti-non-binary. They're just anti-trans in general. Before continuing to discuss the poll, I want to note again that I am in full support of non-binary. I'm discussing what people say here who don't agree because I think understanding what people actually do believe instead of strawmanning with every transmed is actually just a literally buck angel is very unproductive. I think people who say these things are genuine and usually not hateful for the most part, but I still do not agree with their positions, and I'll be discussing my own views on it after going through the poll. I structured the poll with these options. Dysphoric non-binary is real. Dysphoric non-binary is real, but many people who say they're non-binary aren't. Non-binary skeptic, non-binary is not real, and I am non-binary. Regarding the option of NB skeptic, because I want to take a second to define it, I feel as though it's not as obvious what it means. In transmed spaces, non-binary skeptic is someone who's essentially agnostic. They don't assert that non-binary is not real, but usually think it lacks any kind of support or actual research or understanding to fully claim that it is real either. Usually kind of a, I'm not really sure, but I'll respect your pronouns type person. The poll results, just going off of votes, were as follows. Non-binary is real received 44 votes, or 18.8%. Non-binary is real, but many people who say they're non-binary aren't, received 92 votes, or 39.4% of votes. Non-binary skeptic received 42 votes, or 18% of votes. Non-binary is not real received 45 votes, or 19.3%, and I am non-binary received 10 votes, or 4.2%. Essentially, it was split pretty much 60-40 on the pro-non-binary end. Before going over the comments, I want to explain why I voted on this the way I did, and obviously what I actually voted for. I voted for non-binary is real, but many people who say they aren't. This is not because I believe people intentionally lie about it or the like, or because I believe it to be any less real than any other gender, but because of two things. One, for many people, non-binary labels can be a stepping stone or sort of easing into identifying as a binary gender, something that I personally experienced, and was also later echoed as a sentiment in the comments by others. Two, in many inclusionist spaces, non-binary is essentially synonymous with gender nonconformity, or even just apathy about your birth sex, and I don't think that that's a legitimate definition, but it does cause people to identify that way when I don't think that that's really anything different than being cis, essentially. That being said, overall, I don't think it's appropriate to try and pick out who these people are or invalidate anyone on the basis of this. Exploring different labels and presentations can be an important part of people's experience of understanding their gender, and whether that person realizes that they're cis or binary trans, I don't think removing the space to allow that exploration is really helpful to anyone. Aside from that, it does run the risk of using stereotypes to essentially backwards transvestigate people, and possibly hurts people who are actually non-binary by nitpicking people who may not fit into your own understanding of what a non-binary person supposedly should look like or act like. Basically, I think it's true that a lot of people who use the label are not actually non-binary, but I don't think it's healthy, productive, or kind to try and discern who those people are until they come to that conclusion themselves, and doing so can hurt actual non-binary people in attempting that. Going to the rest of the poll, however, I'm going to try and summarize what responses I got from each category, starting with pro-non-binary, which I will be combining into what I voted for, as they're pretty similar and people who voted the way I did essentially gave the same reasoning. The general consensus from the pro-non-binary crowd was that dysphoria is proven to be the result of masculinization or feminization of the brain that's opposite to the sex organs. Even in binary trans people, there are some areas where this isn't a one-to-one identicalness with their birth sex or with the opposite sex, and it's pretty reasonable to assume that for some trans people, this brain difference only went halfway. It potentially started later, maybe the hormone presence in the womb was less pronounced, etc. Basically, that our neurological model for transness in no way precludes non-binary from existing, and it actually fits quite nicely into this model in a way that doesn't require a lot of extreme assumptions or propositions. People also stated that many non-binary people describe their own dysphoria in a way that's similar to binary people, but that is, quote, doesn't even sound like they copied our homework. Essentially, that clearly they experience legitimate dysphoria, but in a way that's notably unique from how binary people do. One person also made a comparison to various intersex conditions, and how that if the body can develop in a sexually ambiguous way, that could be possible for gender/brains as well, and how other conditions such as autism or bipolar can result in brain differences. Essentially, there's a lot of unconventional ways that people can develop, both neurologically and sexually. So it's not really all that wild to say that's also possible for sexual dimorphism in the brain as well. There was also a sentiment from a few people in the pro-non-binary crowd that they feel a bit bad for non-binary folks, as it's much easier to appropriate due to the culture surrounding it that gender inclusionists have created, and wishing non-binary people had better support structures to manage their dysphoria as well as just to build community. One person also compared it to asexuality or aromanticism, that if you can essentially be quote-unquote null in a sexuality sense, why couldn't you in your gender identity as well? From the middle-of-the-road non-binary skeptic crowd, I heard a wider array of opinions here. Some people leaning a bit more in one direction than others, and some essentially throwing their hands up and saying, hell if I know. One person stated that they think it does exist, but they're not really sure if it's the same thing as being trans, since there's no clear transition path for non-binary folks. One person was basically just like, I'm not really sure. She said she identified as non-binary for a long while to cope with being unable to medically transition, but later couldn't manage it anymore after a relationship she had. She later came to know a non-binary person and would date them who was on HRT for years but didn't want any surgery, but they were clearly not cis. They said that they were really sure this person wasn't confused or lying, and that they had been out and on HRT for years despite having a conservative family. But this person also identified as a lesbian despite having a beard and generally being okay with referred to as a man, which they said they don't really understand. She said, quote, "From my experience, there are like 3 types of non-binary people. Binary trans people in denial, non-binary people with dysphoria who are also partly medically transitioning, and non-binary people without dysphoria who act and look like they're AGAB but don't want to be associated with it," end quote. She further went on to say that she's not really sure how to feel about it, but she'll respect their identity regardless, even if it's kind of confusing or can be frustrating sometimes. One person gave an answer that's essentially the equivalent of agnosticism, stating there's not enough research into it for them to confidently say it is real, but there's also not enough information for them to feel comfortable saying it's not either. They also made a comparison to physical intersex conditions, saying it could be like that, but again, we don't really know. They finished the comment by stating that regardless of if it's real or not, though, a lot of non-dysphoric people do say that they're non-binary, and that those people definitely aren't non-binary, but are rather simply gender non-conforming. One person stated they used to be fully pro-non-binary, but are a skeptic now, and that they'll respect people's pronouns and identities, but internally can be kind of suspicious. They said they feel like a lot of cis people may realize they're not trans, but instead of having to admit that and detransition, they may say they're non-binary instead in order to not have to leave the trans community. They also said they feel like some people who identify as non-binary may still be dealing with a bit of internalized transphobia and not want to admit themselves that they're binary, or are dealing with some kind of insecurity, as this person said that they previously identified as non-binary because they said they didn't feel like enough of a man. In regards to the I do not support non-binary category, there were a range of reasons here, but they seem to have a pretty united overall theme. Most of them did state that they believed there were sort of 2 types of people who identify as non-binary. Some that may be binary trans, but feel as though it's easier to use non-binary as a stepping stone or sort of a test run to feel it out. Some of them may be using it to cope in the way that the person in the skeptic section mentioned, that they're too early in their transition to feel comfortable saying they're a man or a woman, so they use non-binary to ease that. They don't seem to believe that people like this are lying, but rather that they're kind of just getting used to it or they're unsure about their identity. One person stated that they think a lot of people can ease their dysphoria by just going quote-unquote halfway, or that maybe it's extra hard for them to pass for whatever reason so they can settle into being non-binary. They also stated, quote, "Lastly, social transition is a bitch and I understand why some people would be scared to do it," end quote. The second type of non-binary that was cited by the non-binary is not real group was essentially inclusionists. This ranged from they think it's just a quirky, easy way to say they're trans when they're not, to the fact that social and political climates of the trans community can make people think that if they're not super masculine or feminine, basically androgynous, or if they're gender non-conforming, that it's the same thing as being trans, so they must be non-binary since they don't identify as the opposite sex at all. One person said they don't think that these people are outright lying, but that they may have their own reasons. Those reasons just are social or political and not because they're trans. There was a unique answer in this category that, as I am obviously an anti-theist, I'm just say inherently less empathetic towards, but nonetheless I think it was interesting, so I don't want to exclude it. This person said that they won't go up to someone and invalidate them or diminish their identity, but that their religion precludes them from believing in non-binary. They did say they also don't think it's mentally a thing, as they don't really understand that, but quote, "As a religious person, it seems to me to conflict with the male and female he created them, but as mentioned before, I will never treat anyone worse or disrespect them just because I feel this way," end quote. Obviously, I have my feelings on this, as it's a good example of religion limiting people's thinking and capacity for critical thinking, and while I still disagree with the other anti-non-binary stances, I do understand where they're coming from, but I'll just leave it at that. This isn't a religion video. And lastly, I only really got 2 responses from people who voted I am non-binary, at least that were clearly as such, as many didn't actually state what they voted for, but it was just clear from the comment itself. This consisted of one of my friends basically going, yes, exactly this, to the person comparing non-binary brain development to bodily intersex conditions, as well as someone stating, quote, I kinda wonder if calling myself non-binary is just an ego wound from failing to transition as a child. Neither here nor there, shrug emoji, I mostly fall into number 2 opinion-wise, end quote. Since there was not a large presence from people who voted for this, I didn't want to give it its own section, but I thought that last comment was kind of funny, so I felt the need to read it. Overall, while this poll doesn't represent all of transmedicalism or even every specific space's attitudes, I do think it was an interesting thing to get to see so many varying opinions on. I found it interesting that the anti-non-binary people actually did agree with pretty much all the reasons I support it, but not all people who say they are, and that they just believed it was the case for all non-binary people instead of just some. I also really loved reading comments from both people I agree with, obviously, but also from the skeptic crowd. While I think that there's enough logical reason to support non-binary, it was very interesting to hear people apply similar thought processes that I've applied to religion or similar topics to this area of discussion. As well as kind of interesting but nice to see people basically go, I'm confused by this, but I still support y'all, I care about you. Where they couldn't really say they thought it was real with full honesty, but often had non-binary people they were very close with and they cared about and respected. Overall, I think things like this are really important, not only to show that a large amount of transmeds are not only in support of non-binary, but have some really interesting ideas I'd love to see explored in proper research, but also to understand that while I think people in the anti-non-binary category are wrong, they don't really seem to be hateful for the most part. But they had pretty grounded reasons for believing what they do, and still showed respect to their non-binary peers despite those disagreements. Such an important part of these discussions is being able to be compassionate and understanding with people you disagree with, whether that's non-binary people for the anti-non-binary group or people that I don't agree with as a transmed who don't support non-binary. Overall, I think it was just really cool to see people calmly and empathetically describing these things. And for people like me or non-transmeds, it can be really useful to have these discussions and maybe sway people to be more of at least a skeptic or in a support position, or even just to coexist in our disagreement and all have respect for each other despite it. I guess the conclusion that I got from this video and the poll was, I think a lot of pro-non-binary transmeds have some really interesting ideas or ways that they understand and describe non-binary, and I'd love to see those ideas explored in real research eventually. And while I don't agree with them, for the most part anti-non-binary transmeds really don't seem like they hate non-binary people or want to harm them, and I didn't see anyone in support of things like misgendering or disrespecting or even like transvestigating people. But a lot of them have seen how the inclusionist attitudes have affected the trans community in a way that I think personally pushed them a little too far to one end, but they're not beliefs built out of hatred. That's all I got today. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like my content, please consider subscribing or checking out my affiliate links in the description. Ha det!
The children think too much, they've hardly a fear of God, always asking questions they should only wish away. Sundays every week with Father Montgomery, as they've gotten older they can hardly stay awake.